I'm Claudia, and you are listening to Blackbird Tales. Hello, everyone, and welcome to Blackbird Tales. Blackbird Tales is a podcast that I'm super happy to start. I intend to make episodes about folklore, the occult, myth, legends, mostly legends of London and the UK, but we might go to other places in the world as well. And to start off, I thought we could start with an interesting story that I don't really hear that often. It's the story of Spring Jack, that was a monster, a creature, a ghost, a devil, depending who you ask, who terrified people of London and then later on of the UK for more than 100 years. First, let's set the scene. Our story begins in 1838. We are at the very beginning of the Victorian era. Queen Victoria has just been crowned the year before. She's only 19 years old when our story starts. It's also the Industrial Revolution, and London is growing super fast because a lot of people are moving to London to go and work in these new factories, etc. So the limits of the city are just being pushed back constantly. And also, London is basically swallowing the villages on its periphery. So it also means that some people who 30 years before that were living in the countryside and the boggle of nowhere end up being absorbed by London, and they also bring with them rural superstitions and folklore, and that will become part of the culture of London. So, our story begins with an anonymous letter, which lands in the hands of the Lord Mayor of London. This letter, nobody takes it seriously. And they should, because it will trigger a series of reactions that will make Spring Jack a legend. And this letter comes from one of the villages that is now part of London, but used to be a small village at the periphery of London, and it's Peckham, south of London. And the Lord Mayor of London, he's a little bit contemptuous when he reads the letter. First of all, he doesn't really understand how this is any of his problem, because, the concerns of peasants in South London. His business is the city, basically. He's not the mayor of London, after all. He's, the representative of corporations who exist within the city. His role still exists, basically, his position, and it is mainly a honorary title. He's elected, he's put in a gold-plated carriage, and there's a parade thrown for him every year, and mainly his job is to shake the hands of other important people. And back in the days, at least, his job was also to listen to people's grievances. So that's kind of how, in 1838, Sir John Cowan, who's the Lord Mayor elected that year, finds himself discussing this anonymous letter during a public session. So, what does this letter contain? So, in the letter, in short, the author of the letter states that a group of young people are having fun by breaking into houses dressed up as ghosts or devils to scare the inhabitants of the houses. And according to the author again, the story is basically covered up by the authorities because the culprits are aristocrats or, high up in society. And they are basically manipulating both the media and the authorities, the police, so that they don't get caught. So that's why the author is sending this letter, because I guess they want to raise awareness on the problem. So when the Lord Mayor reads the letter, he expects to cause just general hilarity in the room. But he did not see two things coming. First, there's a man in the audience that stands up and declares that indeed there's been a rumor in South London for several months, and all the servants tell each other these stories of being attacked by devils and ghosts quite regularly. The other thing that Sir John Cowan didn't foresee is that in the audience that day, there's a reporter from the Times, which is, a very respectable newspaper. It still exists as well, with a very large circulation even back then. And the reporter is very, very interested by this case. The next day, an article is published, and that article is quickly picked up by all the other newspapers. And each one is relaying the rumor or the words of a presumed victim, kind of like, yeah, we found this person who's like the sister-in-law of the best friend of someone who was attacked. And with this new media coverage, there's a lot of new testimonies that come and flood the offices of all the London newspapers. Obviously, the newspapers keep a cool head, even if the new testimonies are telling stories of ghosts, monsters, bears, etc., they decide to rationalize everything. They just say, they explain it by saying it is probably pranksters, this kind of things. But when, they are cross-referenced, all these stories have common traits. The monster always has claws, big red eyes, and above all, a quite uncommon ability to jump high over walls and fences. So they decide to call him Spring-Heeled Jack. So for the moment, that monster is a bit elusive. But the name of a suspect is already being whispered around town. It is the name of Lord Henry Beresford, Marquis of Waterford, aka the Mad Marquis. And it's fair enough because he has quite the reputation. Everyone in London still remembers last year, which is when Beresford, with his gang of aristocratic friends, went to Mountain Mowbray, got really, really drunk, and they literally destroyed the entire town. They ended up beating up the authorities, the police, and they painted half the town red, which is where the saying painting the town red comes from, by the way. And of course, because, he's a Marquis, etc., he and his friends, they got off with a slap on the wrist, literally. And everyone was quite shocked by that. And also, that didn't calm him down, because a few months after that, he was in the news again, because he started a fight in Norway, and he had to be basically rushed home back to the UK after being hit on the head with a Morgenstern, which is, in case you don't know, also called a morning star, I think, and it's like I don't know, Steve in Stranger Things, like the baseball bat with the nails in it. Well, that would qualify as a Morgenstern, basically. It's kind of like a heavy object with spikes at the end of it for extra damage. So, needless to say, at the beginning of 1838, when all these rumors are about, everyone is side-eyeing him. Because at the end of the day, everyone knows that if there's an aristocrat in the country stupid enough to make a bet with his buddies about, breaking and entering into random people's houses, it's Henry Beresford. But no one has any proof, so in the meantime, Londoners decide to organize. They form committees with the aim of unmasking the wrongdoers, and the Lord Mayor receives, probably to his astonishment, £35 in contributions for legal fees. So that's £4,000 today, so that's quite a lot of money. But on the 20th of February 1838, the entire affair takes a very dark turn, and the police starts to get involved. Jane Aslop is what you could call a young girl from a good family. She's 18 and she lives with her parents on Bearbinder Lane in East London. The Aslop family lives in an isolated cottage that is between two villages, Bow and Oldford. And during that evening, Jane and her little sister Mary they receive a visit from their older sister, Mrs. Harrison, who's going to be very important in the story. So at 9:30 that night in the evening, someone rings the outside gate bell. So Jane comes out of the house and she finds a figure there in the darkness. And the figure tells her, I'm a policeman. Please go get me a light. We've just captured Spring-Heeled Jack. We're holding him, etc., etc. So she rushes inside, she grabs a candle, and she returns to give it to the policeman, who grabs it. But suddenly, he gets rid of the cloak in which he was wrapped, and in the light, Jane realizes, probably horrified, that the creature standing there isn't a policeman at all, and it's a weird creature, very tall, dressed in a oilskin, like a shiny outfit. His eyes are red, and suddenly he starts spitting blue and white flames. Then he rushes towards her, he grabs her by the neck, and she can feel he has metallic claws on his hands, and he tears off her clothes. So she's screaming, she's struggling, she manages to escape the monster, she runs through to the front door, but unfortunately he's quicker, and he catches up with her, and he just grabs her again, and he starts dragging her towards the outside gate again. Basically, according to Jane, it kind of sounds like he was trying to kidnap her, basically. Then the front door of the house swings open, and Jane little sister, because Jane is 18, so the little sister Mary, she must be what? I think she's 15. I think in an article they say she's 15. So she's a child, basically, and she's heard Jane screaming, so she opens the door, she sees this horrifying scene, and she's petrified by fear. So she just stands there, kind of like with, big eyes and just being terrified. That's where Mrs. Harrison, the older sister, who's married, I don't know her first name because she's just called Mrs. Harrison because, you disappear behind your husband's name, apparently, in Victorian times. So she hears the noise. I think it's kind of implied in the articles that the parents are in bed, basically, at that point. So the older sister is probably the only actual adult on the scene. She goes out, and she sees, the horrible stuff happening. And because she's a massive badass, basically, just goes down, grabs her sister, grabs the other sister who's under the porch, kind of throws them inside the house, closes the door behind her, and it's all fine. But it's not actually all fine, because Spring-Heeled Jack doesn't go away. He goes to the door of the house and he starts to knock at it at the front door for quite some time, until Mrs. Harrison again is done and goes upstairs, opens a window, and she starts shouting on the street, calling the police, basically. So that's when Jack disappears, and vanishes in the night. The next day, the Aslop family is taking care of Jane, and they start to notice Jane's condition, which, in addition to the shock of the attack, she also is showing a lot of very real injuries. Basically cuts, etc., from the clothes. I think he pulled off some of her hair as well. And Mr. Aslop does not intend to let the monster who attacked his daughter run in the streets. So on the same day, they all go to the police station to tell the story. So the police takes their statements, and of course the case ends up in the newspaper. And the case arouses public indignation, basically. The authorities take it very seriously because it's quite hard to pass off the scratches on Jane's arms as a superstition, which was the theory that the newspapers had. So the new theory is that there was an attack, but the demonic appearance of Spring Hill Jack is because Jane was so scared that the shock made her imagine things, basically. So an investigation is opened in Lambeth Street Police Station, and a person called Officer Lee is put in charge of the case. Lee has a very good reputation. He's considered by some to be the best cop of his generation. He's trained with the city's first ever police officers, the Bow Street Runners, and also he's had great success because he caught the culprit in a high-profile murder case a few years earlier. So he's kind of like, he's a famous cop, basically. And Officer Lee is under quite a lot of pressure because the attack is all over the news, and everyone in London is starting to be quite scared of Spring Hill Jack, because up until now, what they had been dealing with is a vague rumor, hearsay, mainly peddled by servants. So women attacked in the streets, especially working class women in the Victorian mentality. It's kind of their fault. What were they doing there? Were they showing off their ankles? That's what you get, etc. But this time with the Aslop case, it's different because Jack has come to attack a middle class girl inside her own home. It means that basically no one is safe. And the police are made to understand that it's time to find, who's behind all of this quite quickly. But unfortunately, before they have the time to do anything, Jack strikes again. So this time, Jack decides to strike in Limehouse, which back in the day was one of London's worst neighborhoods. Because in addition to the overcrowding and stale air found everywhere in the East End, in Limehouse there was docks, and docks bring with them quite a lot of unsavory characters and illegal, smugglers, traffics, etc., especially in the 19th century. Until quite recently, and I mean, when I say recently, I'm talking about 1838, pirates were hung in plain sight along the river, the Thames, to give, a little taste to other pirates who might be coming, hoping, to lie low or maybe to sell what they had stolen in London. So it was supposed to give them a bit of a warning. And that's also where we find the next victim of Spring Hill Jack, who is called Lucy Scales, and she's another 18-year-old woman who was living locally. So on February 28th, so that's 8 days after Jane Aslop's attack, Lucy and her older sister leaves their brother's home, and they're walking through a little alley called Green Dragon Alley, when Lucy, who's walking ahead of her sister, it's a very small alley basically, she sees a figure lurking in in the shadows, like under the porch of the door, and basically she hardly has the time to realize what's going on when he jumps on her and spits blue flames directly at her. So the young woman collapses because she's terrified. Her sister is also petrified for quite, for a few seconds before she rushes towards her to help her. And basically, Spring Hill Jack this time, he vanishes because the brother hears the screams of his sisters, and I think they probably parted ways on the street or something like that, because they give his address in the articles and it doesn't make a lot of sense because it's quite far away. Like, I don't think he heard it from his house. I think he was just like the street next door basically, and heard the screams, rushed towards them, and when he saw a dude showing up, he left Spring Hill Jack. So in the Lambeth Street police station, it was probably quite chaotic at this point because the police is starting to look a little bit stupid with that case. One of the detectives, like also one of it's like the head detective or something like that, is someone in charge, made a declaration literally a week earlier saying that Spring Hill Jack would never strike twice in the East End. Because so far, the rumor was mainly spread in South London. Remember, like the letter comes from Peckham, all the the sightings of Jack as like a bear and stuff like that was mostly in like Richmond, etc. Kind of like quite far away. But clearly now his playground has become the East End, and in 8 days there's been 3 attacks by this creature. Yeah, 3 attacks because in addition to Jane Aslop and Lucy Scales, he also terrorized a young valet, like a teenage butler, who was in the service of a gentleman who lives in the East End. So Officer Lee is now the officer in charge of everything Spring Hill Jack. He was already in charge of the Jane Aslop case, and now he's also given the Lucy Scales case because everyone can see that they're related. But at the time, for a little bit of context, let's remember that this is the infancy of any kind of police work, basically. They didn't have any forensics, they didn't have any techniques, they didn't have fingerprints, they had nothing really to work with in terms of technology, and there's no database or anything like that. And mostly, my understanding is that the police job at the time was mainly to just run after people with a baton and a whistle. So I'm not quite sure how used to investigations they were. So it's not great to catch a demon, mainly known for jumping over buildings. On top of that, the case itself is a little bit hard to explain. For instance, it's a monster with red eyes, big claws, spitting blue fireballs. It's a bit ridiculous, but the victims are real and also clearly they've been attacked. They show wounds, etc. So there's something really really nasty at play here. Also, the problem is that the two most rational theories are not really working anymore. So the first theory was it was a group of drunk aristocrats deciding to wreak havoc, across London. The creature that Jane Aslop and Lucy Scales describe is a little bit too elaborate, a little bit too, it's planned, like it's an elaborate outfit. It doesn't scream of a drunk prank, basically. And the second theory is that it's a ghost. So, if you're a little bit rational, you can't really go with that. And, Lee can't really just go to his bosses and say, yeah, well, okay, it was a demon. Case closed. So the only thing that stands up is that it's an actual person, a single person, or maybe a duo, etc. Um, and they are actually spitting fireballs. But that's impossible, isn't it? Isn't it? So Lee ends up at the Royal London Hospital to play scientist, basically. With the help of some doctors, he does several experiments. His end goal is to determine whether or not it is possible to spit blue fire. And the conclusion of his research is quite surprising because it is apparently possible. He ends up discovering that with a mixture of wine and sulfur, it is possible to create a very, very similar effect to the one described by the victims of Spring Hill Jack. And wine and sulfur is not really hard to find either. So the pieces of the puzzle fit together perfectly. They also explain why Jack insisted that Jane Aslop bring him a lamp, probably because he needed to light his little device. And it also means that Jack is probably one and the same person, because, like, the technique is, at the end of the day, quite elaborate for it to be two people just coming up with the same idea. But where Lee makes a mistake is that he talks to the newspapers, and he does try to not give the entire recipe away, but he just says enough. So the newspaper publish his conclusion that, like, oh, he's investigating and he's discovered that, there's a very flammable solution you can make with wine and sulfur, etc. But that's enough for some people, and they come up with the recipe themselves. And also, it gives them ideas as to how to impersonate Spring Hill Jack. And that's where we start to see Spring Hill Jacks, plural, everywhere across the country. So while it is quite possible that all these early attacks were the work of the same perpetrator, the rest of Spring Hill Jack's career seems to have been the work of imitators. And just a few days after the Lucy Scales attack, we start to see all these, imitators coming out of the woods. Some of them are already being questioned by the police, others are basically handing themselves in. For instance, in March, the Morning Herald reported that the man entered a pub the day before and he was shouting that he was Spring Hill Jack, and then he just grabbed a club and he tried to hit the landlady with it, but he missed and he ended up in prison. We also start to see the first Jacks in court. For instance, a young man named James Painter found himself in front of a judge because he frightened two women. One of them was his landlady or his boss, something like that, by basically running towards them wearing a sheet. And on top of the sheet there was a mask, and on top of the mask there was a fake beard. So he was condemned to pay a fine of £4, which is 400 now, so it's quite a lot. But for the policeman James Lee, the real suspects are two men, Payne and Milbank. Will Wright, named Smith, came across them shortly after the attack in the very street where the Aslops lived, on Bearbinder Lane. Milbank was wearing a white hat and a white jacket, which roughly matches Jane's description of what Jack was wearing. Later that evening, the wheelwright Smith passes a local pub, the Morgan Arms, which still exists, by the way, and they make great burgers. And the two men recognize Smith and come out of the bar to threaten him. Basically, I guess they're a little bit twitchy to have been seen by this guy on the streets. I mean, if they're guilty, maybe they're just drunk. They were drunk, by the way. So they take his wheel, Yeah, because a wheelwright is the person who made like the wheels for like horse-drawn cabs and such. So he's in the story he's carrying a massive wheel on his back. So they take his wheel and they ask him if he has anything to say to Spring Jack. And Payne, who's the calmer one apparently of the two, ends up restraining Milbank, and in the end he kind of drags him back inside the pub because Milbank is really, he's really intimidating Smith. So Smith is quite upset because I kind of guess that they broke his will, and I kind of also guess that he probably took like 5 months to make a wheel or something. It was probably not super easy to be a wheelwright. So he's quite upset. He goes inside the pub, and instead of chasing them because he's smarter than that, he goes to the owner of the pub, and he asks for if the guy knows the names of his attackers. And the owner of the pub is like, oh yeah, of course, that's Thomas Milbank. He lives opposite the pub. So it's, after that, of course, Smith goes to the police with this information. So Lee, the cop, thinks he's got his culprit. But as he investigates further in the neighborhood, he comes across another witness, a cobbler named Richardson, who claims to have seen Milbank in Payne also, but he's also seen a man wearing a long cape with accompanied by a little boy, and they were both snickering about the fact that Spring Hill Jack was on the street or something like that. And Richardson is adamant that Milbank and the mystery man with the cape were two separate people. So, for Lee, in both cases, there is reason to be suspicious. Aslop was the first attack to be widely publicized in the press. Before that, Spring Hill Jack was a name, but it was more of a rumor, and he was like, in South London, etc. So if there was someone speaking about Spring Hill Jack on the street where the attack was done that night, it's definitely raising suspicions for him. But the final blow to Lee's theory about Milbank comes from Jane Aslop herself. She absolutely doesn't recognize Milbank. She says Milbank is older, he's shorter, and he's fatter than Jack. Furthermore, she insists that her attacker was sober and did not smell of alcohol at all, whereas according to everyone who met him that night, Thomas Milbank was drunk as a skunk. So with all these contradictory testimonies, Lee doesn't have enough evidence to bring the case before a judge, and his investigation will never go any further. After these three main attacks, Jack became more discreet in London at least, because elsewhere in the country, throughout the 1840s, local newspapers began to report his appearances. First, he was seen in Southend, attacking a young girl on the cliff, or in Surrey, terrifying a teenager. Then he left the London area. In 1841, he attacked a young girl in Bristol to cut a lock of her hair, apparently. He was even captured in Suffolk, and he was placed in a cell before he vanished. And according to the local newspaper, he vanished by transforming into a spirit using chemical processes. So we can tell that the middle of the 19th century was not super familiar with science and what it could do, clearly. In Brentford in 1841, a butcher, Richard Bradford, found himself before the judge because he was suspected of imitating Spring Hill Jack in order to scare young women. But he explained that, on the contrary, he was not Spring Hill Jack. He was disguising himself as a woman to attract Spring Hill Jack and capture him. So I think the judge probably thought that that was beyond his his scope of competence, and he just let him go. But on the whole, Jack is showing up less and less, and he only appears in London very rarely. Usually, it's a prankster. By 1860, Jack has almost completely disappeared. In the collective unconscious, the culprit was probably Waterford, the Marquis of Waterford. However, this theory is a bit of a stretch, because even if the aristocrat still has, the same, um, terrible reputation, he married in 1842 and really calmed down after that. He moved to Ireland and he lived a kind of peaceful life until he died in a horse accident in 1859. So not only he was not in the UK anymore, but also, as far as we know, he never, he stopped his shenanigans. So that means that even though the Marquis could theoretically have been responsible for the first attacks, he has nothing to do with the most recent ones. He can't be responsible for everything that has been attributed to Spring-Heeled Jack, because he was either not in the country, or he was dead. So also, I think, because it's a strong theory, I think it's important to point out that there is no evidence that he is Jack, other than he has a terrible reputation, and the Peckham letter, the one that had been sent to the Lord Mayor, points towards an aristocrat, or rather a gang of aristocrats. So while Jack seems to be no more than a vague memory from 20 years ago, the 1860s will mark the beginning of Jack's second life, the life of the fictional character. The theatre was first to see Jack's potential as a fiction hero. In 1863, in the Grecian Theatre in London, a play starring Jack as the main character was started. 5 years later, another play would be super successful. The play was called Spring-Heeled Jack, The Terror of London. In the press, and in particular in the Penny Dreadfuls, Spring-Heeled Jack becomes a fan favorite. So Penny Dreadfuls are these very cheap magazines that were made for kids of the working class, basically, in the 19th century. And they had a terrible reputation as well. They liked to publish fictions very loosely based on facts. And they would just keep writing them, even if they invented most of it, until people got fed up with it. And that's how they ended up turning, proper arseholes like Dick Turpin into Robin Hood kind of heroes. In the Penny Dreadfuls, Jack is dressed with a reversible cape. He also wears a big W on his chest. He has a mask, he has gloves, and he's on the front page of these magazines. Which honestly makes me think so much of comics, because this is like a superhero outfit. So, unsurprisingly, as he starts to show up in fiction, he also starts to reappear in the media. People start to see Spring-Heeled Jack again. So, first, a ghost in Peckham makes the news. Yes, you remember Peckham, that's the village in South London where the author of the letter to the Lord Mayor was writing from. So people start to wonder if this ghost is not actually Spring-Heeled Jack, who's, going back to his roots. I'm considering making a mini episode on the Peckham ghost and other ghosts of London from the 19th century. So if that's something you think could be interesting, let me know. But in the spring of 1877, Spring Hill Jack decides to strike hard and make a big comeback in the newspaper by attacking the Queen's army, no less. So the Time revealed that he's been raging in Aldershot for weeks. He's been attacking isolated guards during their rounds. He jumps on them, he slaps them, or even in a couple of cases, he caresses their faces in the dark before he jumps out of reach. So, to motivate the soldiers who are really scared to go and do their rounds, the base administration now makes them work in pairs, and they also provided the soldiers with live ammunitions. That's unsuccessful, actually, because apparently when they shoot at Jack, the bullets have no effect whatsoever. Obviously, these new sightings of Jack are a godsend for the Penny Dreadfuls, and publications starring Jack in the front page multiply. Series of several dozen episodes are published. He's constantly put on the cover of the magazines to sell more copies. He is now everywhere in the media and also in the fiction world. The following year, still at the Aldershot base, he comes back. Once again, he's shot at without ever being wounded, and nobody manages to capture him. The newspapers have a little theory. What if this Jack was another officer of the base? This theory reaches the ears of the army administration, and they order the soldiers to stop shooting at the ghost. Finally, in December, a soldier stabs Jack with a bayonet in the leg, and it's revealed that the prankster was indeed a junior officer. Aldershot is the last major story we have from Spring Hill Jack. After that, he continues to make appearances from time to time all over the country. In the 1880s, he was seen in Windsor or in Wales, but little by little, he disappears. Even in fiction, there is no more mention of his adventures, but rather the effort to unmask an imposter that uses Spring Hill Jack as a disguise. A little bit like Frankenstein's monster in Scooby-Doo, for instance. In 1888, the national press has its eyes on Whitechapel, reporting on the crimes of his much less grotesque namesake, Jack the Ripper. Spring Hill Jack, after that, will disappear from the media for quite a long time. And thereafter, Jack is mostly mentioned as an emblematic character of the Penny Dreadfuls, especially at a time when the harmful influence of the Penny Dreadfuls on the youth is constantly debated. They really were the video games of their time. His legend will have a few twists and turns in the 20th century, and the very, very last sighting of Spring Hill Jack happened in 1937. The following year, in 1938, on the other side of the Atlantic Ocean, the inhabitants of Cape Cod, Massachusetts, reported that they had seen a disturbing creature, which they decided to call the Black Flash. This creature was tall, dressed all in black, with big red eyes. And it is said that he attacked a teenager. And after that, he spat flames and he escaped in the dark by jumping several meters high. that's it. That was the story of Spring Hill Jack. I hope you enjoyed listening to it. I thought I would do a second part giving you my 2 cents about the story. For instance, who was Spring Hill Jack? I think he's an interesting character. First of all, I like the fact that he's a little bit, you know, one of a kind. He's between an urban myth, but also, like there's a little bit of a devilish aspect to him. There's also he's supposed to be a ghost. He's kind of in between different worlds, really, on so many levels. And I like the fact that he never seems to disappear. He has a surprising longevity for a creature that is, so vague. Maybe it's because there was actual victims, and usually when you have like a ghost legend, you don't actually have people who show up to the police and say, "Oh, yeah, well, that ghost attacked me." But still, like it's almost an exact 100 years between his first sighting in 1838 and his last one in the UK in 1937. So that's quite incredible. So who was he? Some people seem to believe that it was Henry Beresford, the Mad Marquis. It is possible in the way that anyone living in the area at the time could have been the culprit. The truth is that there's literally no clues really. So the only clue pointing towards him is probably that letter sent to the Lord Mayor, but we have no idea who sent this. It was an anonymous letter, so this person could be wrong. So I personally don't think it's him. I think it would be a lot, and he would be a very busy man if it was him. I do think that the first three attacks, the Aslop, Lucy Scales, and also the Valley, have been done by the same person, because the descriptions of Spring Hill Jack in their case are almost identical, whereas before that it was more of a rumor, and one day he was a ghost, one day he was a devil, one day he was a bear. Like, it didn't make a lot of sense, whereas it's very homogeneous. It makes a lot of sense. These three, they live in the same borough. They see the same things. He's doing the same. He's spitting blue flames. He's doing the exact same stuff. He has similar techniques. Like MO, and after that, he everything else in the country is just it's funny, but it's a bit bonkers. So I do think that there's a case to be made for someone being guilty of being Spring Hill Jack, like not just thousands of imitators, but maybe one person being like the original character, let's say. And I do think that there's a strong case against Thomas Milbank, because first of all, like, he was seen on the street of the attack, on the night of the attack of Jane Aslop, which I mean, I did a little bit of research, and Bury-by-the-Len is it's Tredegar Road now for people who live in East London. It's a little bit under Roman Road, and back in the days, when you look at the map, there's nothing. It's the countryside. There's like a couple of houses, but there's not much. I don't think this was a road that had a lot of people on it at 9:30 at night, honestly. So the fact that he's here is already a red flag. He's talking and threatening people outside of a pub, and using Spring Hill Jack. So you know what? I'm convinced that he did something to that wheel, right? I think he broke his wheel or something like that. Now, did he actually say, "Yeah, I'm Spring Hill Jack" to him? I don't know, because at the end of the day, that's the thing with Milbank, is that Aslop doesn't recognize him. People have seen him, but no one has heard him say the Spring Hill Jack thing, apart from this Wheelwright, and this Wheelwright obviously hates the guy, so maybe he's, misremembering, maybe he just wants him to get in trouble, I don't know. So at the end of the day, I don't think there was a lot, against him. But I, you know, I think that the fact that he's been seen literally outside her house at the time makes him probably the best suspect. But to be completely honest, and if there's any descendants of Thomas Milbank listening to this, I don't want to slag off your ancestor. But yeah, to be honest, it's very weak. I feel like he's the strongest suspect because all the other suspects are really, really weak. Also, there's that man in a cape that was seen by the other guy, Richardson, who says that he has seen Milbank, but he's also seen this even more suspicious person, like wearing a long cape and walking around with a little boy talking about Spring Hill Jack. So that would be, a great suspect too. But apparently, there was a man living in the neighborhood who took over Lee after a while and he started to do his own investigation. And he found the man in a cape. Like, he actually found, like, he looked around his neighbors, etc. And he found the guy that was like, oh, yeah, that was me and my son. I was wearing a big cape. So. And of course, the guy was saying, yeah, I'm not Spring Hill Jack. So I don't know. I don't know. I feel like. Like Smith, the wheelwright, had an actual conversation with Milbank, and he's adamant that Milbank said that he was Spring Hill Jack. But on the other hand, like people also brag about things that they aren't if they want to intimidate people, So I don't know. I don't know. As for his motivations, well, I think most of the Spring Hill Jack sightings were pranks. A lot of them are, he bounced, in the road, out of the road, etc. But I'm a bit, for the tree attacks, the Aslop, Scales, and the Valley thing, I can't help but wonder if there was something a little bit darker at play. Because if it's a prankster, it's a very cruel one because he really hurts Jane Aslop. Also, a lot of the victims were women, so it could be quite an unsavory character, really. And especially the Jane Aslop case, he was trying to drag her out of her cottage, like out of the gate. So there's a part of me that wonders if Spring Hill Jack, maybe he attacked other people and, he. And they never reported it or something like that. Because like I feel like the three cases we have, it's kind of like it's near misses, like he clearly has something a little bit nasty in mind, and he just he has to give up at the last minute because other people get involved. So I can't help but wonder what happened if the same guy had tried to do it to a woman who was walking like alone for real on the street. Like, he could actually be a serial killer and we wouldn't know. But maybe that's a stretch. Maybe it's because he's called Jack, so I'm just associating him with Jack the Ripper. I don't know. Either way, I think it's a very interesting story. I think it's not very well known, so I hope maybe you heard it for the first time. I hope you liked the story. And I'm gonna leave you with one last thing that I found in the local press researching this story. I know, deep down we all want legends and ghost stories to be a little bit real, so that there's a little bit of magic in the world. So this is the last anecdote. It's something I found in the local garden. In 2012, the Martin family went out for Valentine's Day. So the Martin family, it's a couple and their son. They took a taxi on the way back, and as they were driving, something just appears in the middle of the road. So the driver panics a little bit, is about to, try to avoid, go on the side to avoid the figure in the middle of the road. But then that creature just jumped and leaped over the wall that was apparently 5 meters high. So that's several feet. And the four passengers of the car, they've all seen it. And so basically they called the police and they said, okay, this is what we've seen. And because they called the police, and it was probably, a no news day, the local newspaper came and, interviewed them. And Mr. Martin said that he is quite a down to earth man, and he's never seen anything move that fast in his life. And that's it. Thank you so much for listening today to this first episode. I would also like to give a special thanks to Ula Taylor-Reilly for making the music and the soundscape of the podcast in general. Thank you so much. And yes, if you would like to be notified when there's a new episode coming out, please follow me on Instagram at the Blackbird Tales. I will also post pictures of, just general things around the episode of today, like the front covers of some Penny Dreadfuls and this kind of things. And please, please, please do send me DMs to tell me what you thought. If you have criticisms, if you have compliments, if you have tips and advice, that would be incredibly useful. This podcast is super new, so honestly, anything you have to tell me will help. So yeah, that's it for today. I'll see you next time, and next episode will be ghostly. So if you want to take a guess as to what it's going to be about, feel free to DM me on Instagram as well. See you!